All right. My name is Steve Lindy, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report, and it's my honor to welcome you all from Jerusalem to this worldwide webinar and to the presentation of the 2020 Boris Mints Institute Prize to Professor Sabina Alkire, Director of the Oxford University Poverty and Human Development Initiative. We welcome each and every one of you. The format for today's ceremony is a Zoom webinar, and unlike a normal video call, audience members do not have cameras or audio enabled. So please don't worry that you can't see yourself on screen or ask a question out loud. This is an interactive webinar and we want to hear from our audience. So if you'd like to submit a question in response to any of the presentations or speeches, you can type it into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. A selection of questions will be answered in the panel discussion later on. Let me say that once again, to be clear, you're welcome to send questions via the Q&A button, but you won't be able to speak or be seen. Before we get started, I'd like to say a special welcome to the president and founder of the Boris Mints Institute, Dr. Boris Mints himself, and to Professor Ariel, the president of Tel Aviv University, and the head of the Boris Mints Institute, Professor Itai Sened. Of course, we'd also like to extend a warm welcome and hearty congratulations to the 2020 Prize Laureate, Professor Sabina Alkire, as well as the 2018 Prize Laureate and Nobel Prize winner for economics, Professor Michael Kremer. We are also fortunate to be joined by members of the Prize Evaluation Committee and the Boris Mints Institute.
Steve is muted.
Worldwide surge in poverty predicted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. To get proceedings underway, it is now my honor to call on the president of Tel Aviv University, Professor Ariel, to give introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. Dear Dr. Boris Mints, the president of the Institute of the Boris Mints Institute, dear Professor Sened, the head of the Institute and the incoming Dean of the Faculty of Social Science at Tel Aviv University, and dear Professor Sabina Alkire, our laureate of the prestigious Boris Mints Institute Prize. I'm very glad to open this event when this prize is awarded. And the goal of the prize is to encourage finding solutions to strategic global challenges. According to the rules of the prize, it is awarded to a researcher who dedicated their academic life to a solution to a strategic global challenge. Usually we used to say that the laureates of the prize are divided to two groups. The first group are those who have already got the Nobel Prize, and the other group are those who are yet to receive the Nobel Prize. So we consider it's a very prestigious prize, and I'm very happy to participate in this event. Now, the laureate of this year dedicated their research to poverty and inequality. And one cannot think of a global challenge more important, more serious, and more challenging than poverty and inequality. Now, poverty is inequality by definition. In the public eye, poverty is understood as inequality of economic inequality. So the type of inequality which is associated with poverty is mostly economic inequality. But of course, we all know that poverty is related to many other inequalities which are not exactly or not only economic. One thing which is quite obvious that poverty is very closely related to health, to good or bad nutrition. So if you are poorer, your nutrition is worse than others, and you are less healthy. It is, of course, related to safety. I'm a law professor working on law and economics, and we all know very well that for firms, it's much cheaper to impose risks on poor people than on rich people. Because if you injure poor people, you pay him or her much less money than if you hit a rich person. And of course, there is a very obvious correlation between poverty and crime. We know that jails are populated by poor people much more than by rich people, and this is, of course, not a coincidence. Now, in recent months, we have seen the relationship also between the harms done by epidemics and poverty. First of all, poor people typically live in a higher density, and getting infected by the virus is much more common when population is, when there is a density of population. And it's not a coincidence that in Israel, for example, Bnei Brak and some other neighbors in Jerusalem has been damaged by the coronavirus much more than other places where the density of the population is much less severe. But even the stay-at-home, which is a strategy that many people prefer to take, this is something that rich people could more easily afford themselves than poor people. So, and you can find many other reasons why even academics damage poor people more than rich people. Now, the challenges of poverty exist, first of all, in developing countries. And Professor Alkire, much of her work is focused on developing countries. The challenge of poverty, of course, exists everywhere. It's a global challenge, but also a domestic challenge. Even in rich countries, there are always poor people. So it's you cannot think of a challenge more common and more important than the challenge of poverty. So I want to congratulate our laureate, and I want to thank the committee, the evaluation committee that have made such a great choice. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Professor Porat, for that introduction. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the founder and president of the Institute, Dr. Boris Mints.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank everyone who found the opportunity to enjoy our video conference. It is a great honor and happiness for me to welcome all of you during this difficult period of time that we have been going through in the recent months. Humanity is facing a global challenge, and we regret to say that we are extremely ill-prepared to respond to this challenge in a meaningful way. International institutions were not ready, and neither were most governments and national systems, both in relation to health care and social aspects. Today, it is obvious to everyone that the consequences of the pandemic will dramatically aggravate the problem of poverty, and not only in the less economically developed countries. Against this landscape, the scientific, practical activities and civil position of our laureate Sabina Alkire the director of Oxford Poverty and Human Initiative, OPHI, professor at the University of Oxford, takes on special significance, arousing great respect and admiration. Developed by her in collaboration with Professor James Foster, the method of measuring multidimensional poverty, API, the so-called Alkire-Foster method, has made a huge contribution to our understanding of the dynamics and consequences of poverty, the fight against poverty around the world. Our outstanding scientific achievements have made it possible to estimate not only the number of poor people, but also the intensity of poverty at the household level. Thanks to OPHI and the collaboration with the United Nations and the World Bank, with the direct leadership of Professor Sabina Alkire, we have managed to build interaction with government authorities in more than 100 less economically developed countries. The study had a direct impact on government policies, which improved the well-being of local communities in these countries. With this in mind, I would like to congratulate the 2020 BIMI Prize winner, Professor Sabina Alkire, and wish her new victories and achievements in the future endeavors. I would also like to thank everyone who has made this event possible, considering the current situation, and I wish you good health and hope you and your close one stay safe. Thank you very much. No hand.
Nobody is speaking. Hi, Boris.
Thank you. No hair.
Steve is on mute.
Steve, you should unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Again, let me thank Dr. Mintz for those words of wisdom and for his generosity in being the driving force behind this prize. And let me reiterate your thanks to everyone who's made this digital event possible in the current circumstances, one of whom is, of course, Professor Itai Senet, the head of the Boris Mints Institute, who will now say a few words. Professor Senet. Professor Senet?
Itai, switch on microphone.
Itai? Can someone help Professor Senet turn on his mic?
Oh.
There you go.
Они быстро sharing.
Professor Sennett, you're on.
Yes, I am. We are trying to share the actual document of the prize with Sabina Alkire. It may or may not work very soon. As you're trying to share it, and we are, Tisha? Okay, so I am presenting Professor Alkire the prize in Dr. Boris Mintz's name, and myself and the entire academic community of the Institute. It is a great honor and pleasure to present this to Professor Alkire, who really is everything that symbolizes everything that the Institute tries to get through and done. In the academic world, one of our biggest challenges is to be relevant to what is going on. And it has always been my feeling, my personal feeling, that oftentimes we come short of this very important goal of making our work relevant. Throughout our work with Dr. Mintz at the Institute from 2015 to this day, we've been fortunate to be incredibly successful in doing exactly that. From the very start of our history, it was an initiative of Dr. Mintz to make sure that everything we do remains relevant to things that actually happen right now on the ground around the globe. It is quite symbolic that Professor Alkire was chosen to be the laureate at the very early stages of the coronavirus. And as the coronavirus spread, and we were just moving through the paperwork of confirming the wonderful work of the committee headed by former Dean of Social Work at Hebrew University, Professor Johnny Gall, that we thank so much for his wonderful work. The coronavirus became more and more of an issue, and the connection between the epidemic and poverty became clearer and clearer 2 weeks ago when the World Organization announced its estimate that the number of poor people is expected to grow by 200 million more people, and probably surpass 1 billion people. And the note was made that we have been reducing poverty, however defined, since 1998. And now we are kind of back to this basic line we started at 1998, which is a huge drawback for all of us. But with people like Professor Alkire, I am confident that we will be quick to address this global challenge. And that is what the Institute is all about. It's about addressing global challenges when they happen and bringing the biggest, most prolific and influential scientists to the forefront to deal with those challenges. Our institute serving as a catalysator to just connect the biggest and most prolific minds, most influential academics with those challenges that we are facing. And what an appropriate choice in Professor Alkire in getting us the exact right person at the exact right front line at the exact right moment. So I really thank Boris Mints for this effort. I want to just mention 3 additional side notes on the work of the Institute that have come to fruition just in the last few weeks. First of all, by common count of dates, this is the Day of Independence of Israel. So congratulations to all of us. One of our graduates, Pina Tamano-Shada, has just been named Minister of Immigration. One of our star researcher, Sagit Azari-Wiesel, completed her PhD just 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago to be exact. She has worked on research very similar to the work of Professor Alkire, only from the other hand. Her work was to find the basic determinants of the vulnerability of the middle class. In other words, what makes people fall into poverty and where exactly they're vulnerable, using methods similar to that of Professor Alkire, in that it is multidimensional, trying to look at different aspects of the lives of the middle class. She is now in full swing working with the Israeli government, trying to figure out the exact models to estimate the return to normal labor markets at the very heart of this effort. And last but not least, another graduate of ours, Karen Umansky, who has just won a very prestigious postdoc with Potsdam in Germany, working on the rise of populist parties in Europe and trying to understand better this wave of populism sweeping the world. Last but not least, I want to thank Joella Flalo for her generous help with the Institute. And we are just embarking on this wonderful project, trying to figure out how you take an old building that is not up to standards and making of it a laboratory for students and for researchers to prove that even old building, of which I've just become the dean, can be transformed in 2 or 3 years into a building that doesn't pollute, that doesn't use too much water, and uses only renewable energy. So this is the kind of things we do. We do it right now. We do it in regards to real challenges. Thank you very much for all of you for coming. And please, Steve, go ahead with the sermon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sennett, and thank you for the Institute's continued focus on addressing some of the world's most serious challenges, including poverty. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor John Gall of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has chaired the evaluation committee for the 2020 Boris Mints Prize, to tell us more about why Professor Alkire was selected as this year's Prize Laureate. Professor Gall.
Okay, so thank you very much. And of course, let me thank the Boris Mints Institute for the opportunity to serve as chair of the 2020 Prize Evaluation Committee. Personally, it enabled me to be better able to be acquainted with the work of the world's leading academics seeking to combat poverty and inequality. It was both an enlightening and reassuring experience to know that these people exist and are engaging in such path-breaking and important work. I'm also grateful to have been able to participate in the evaluation process alongside my wonderful colleagues, Professors Janet Grornick and Wim van Olschot. They made the really difficult task of choosing one recipient out of an extremely distinguished group much easier. We chose Professor Alkire as a recipient of the 2020 BMI Prize due to her exceptional contribution to our understanding of dynamics and implications of poverty, and because of the impact of her work on the struggle against poverty throughout the world, and in particular in developing countries. Though a prolific scholar in many ways, undoubtedly Professor Alkire's major academic contribution, and this I'm following up with Dr. Mintz's comments, her major academic contribution was certainly her collaboration with James Foster in developing the Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI, which does not only provide a head count of who is poor, but crucially also indicates the intensity of poverty at the household level. As one of the reviewers of her work noted, This is revolutionary for public policy since it allows the government to focus on the poorest of the poor. Alongside her academic achievements, Professor Alkire has devoted much of her career until now to working to address poverty in different societies through her leadership at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Through this initiative and in collaboration with the United Nations and the World Bank, she has led the effort to employ the MPI as a means to identify the challenges of poverty and the impact of policy on it in a great number of developing nations. We believe that Professor Alkire's receipt of the BMI Prize will offer due recognition to her for being the driving force behind institutions that have guided the struggle to better understand and combat poverty, be they international organizations, national statistical offices, or policy-making bodies in national and subnational governments throughout the global north and south. In short, we unanimously chose Professor Alkire for the BMI Prize because of her enormous contribution to addressing poverty across the globe, and the hope that the prize will also offer encouragement to her and to similarly minded academics to continue working to employ knowledge in this just struggle. So congratulations, Professor Alkire, on behalf of the Evaluation Committee.
Thank you so much, Professor Gall. Congratulations. And now we're fortunate to be able to hear from the prize laureate herself. Joining us live from Oxford University, Professor Sabina Alkire will give a keynote presentation on her vital research, which will be followed by questions from members of the Boris Mints Advisory Board and former prize laureate Professor Michael Kremer. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Sabina Alkire, Director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and this year's 2020 Boris Mints Prize Laureate. Professor Alkire.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to receive this prize from the Boris Mints Institute and to hopefully be able to learn from you and continue to interact with you in times to come. And I feel that I do so on behalf of many colleagues and collaborators whose inspiration, insights, patience, hard work, wacky humor, and sheer grit have built up this research area. And I think on behalf of all, we thank you. What prompted me was the name of the Boris Mints Institute, Strategic Policy Solutions for Global Challenges. And that name is wonderful, because it suggests a kind of thinking that's problem-focused, that's practical, rigorous, deliberate, and coordinated, but focused to move the needle on core issues, of which poverty is one and others are also clearly necessary. And also that they craft such solutions by engaging students' curiosity, creativity, and energy. And I do hope that there will be engagement also with the students, perhaps that are viewing online. The hope here is that we could find a way to articulate how concepts and metrics of multidimensional poverty can be strategic tools to address global poverty in all its forms, including during this pandemic and recession, and to try to think of some concrete next steps that would make market change in this particular time and era. And I want to recognize that measures are no panacea. We don't wake up and want to measure poverty because that's what we want to do. We want to end poverty. But by rigorously framing and monitoring a multidimensional objective like poverty, by offering both a headline number that many can understand, but also some precise and detailed disaggregated information that could guide policy, you might be able to enable multiple actors to work towards a common goal and see how they're doing along the way. But first, as our one of our moderators is directed at International Center on Human Development, I thought that I would open with a verse translated by Mahbub al-Haq, the author of the first Human Development Report in 1990. He wrote, "To this day, and the deep pain of this day, a pain that is a silent insult to the false glamour of life around. Those words of dedication seem apt during this time of COVID, and they recognize that research on poverty in general, or poverty measurement, must have a different character. And Tony Atkinson's book, published posthumously last year, in a sense opens with a very relevant insight on that. He said, the first chapter spoke of the link to action, that learning about the extent of poverty or its measure is important, but it's the link between a measure and action that marks out poverty measurement from many other subjects of study in the social sciences. And poverty statistics matter because they motivate people to tackle a key challenge. That's their strategic role among many different tools and kinds of expertise, all of which are equally important in redressing poverty. And in that sense, the role of poverty statistics in that community of expertise was to keep the challenge of poverty high on the agenda of governments and citizens. And it's interesting, therefore, how he positioned work to measure poverty around the world. He documented many examples where political leaders had learned about poverty and then had campaigned and undertaken practical action. And then observed in our day, writing during the SDG Agenda 2030 time, that the SDG targets, in a sense, were relying on statistics, that if we can't measure poverty in all its forms and dimensions, then a political commitment to end it has no force. Indeed, he went a little bit further to recognize that poverty statistics, in some sense, can be a performance indicator of governance. And so it's that link between rigorous measures, which are axiomatically sound, thanks to James Foster, and to all the students watching. I should mention that James authored his first very widely cited paper on poverty measurement while he was a graduate student. And so the floor is open and you are invited. But the statistics only really have that measurement relevance if they are linked to action. And so it's exploring and trying to find out how to make that link, which is perhaps of interest. So what is the concept and measure of multidimensional poverty? Very, very quickly. I'll draw on a wonderful book by Joe Wolf and Avner Jasholet called Disadvantage. And they frame the policy goal as a society in which disadvantages do not cluster. And by clustering, they mean one person having a lot of them at the same time and others few or none. So just to be very brief and obvious about that, if you have a society of 4 people, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4 deprivations, health, education, shelter, and water, and you know from a dashboard that 25% of people are deprived in each indicator, you still don't know which society do you have. Do you have distribution 1, where one person is deprived in 1 indicator each? Or do you have society 2, where 3 people have nothing, but 1 person is carrying 4 deprivations? So a multidimensional poverty metric tries to bring into view the joint distribution or overlapping or coupled clustered deprivations that poor people carry at the same time. We might think that there would be ways of predicting that, but now we have lots of microdata. So just to give one simple example, 14% of people in 101 countries lived in a household where a child was out of school, and 14% lived in a household where no adult completed 5 years of schooling. So you would think 14%, they're the same people. Educated parents don't send their kids to school. But actually, it's 5% that are the same, and the others have 1 deprivation, but not the other. And as we look across a lot of indicators, we see these complex patterns of overlap. There are interlinkages, and 98.8% of the 1.3 billion people we identify as poor are deprived in at least 3 indicators, for example. But they're not uniform. You can't boil them down to a proxy. So very briefly, the measurement strategy is just to select some indicators, and in the global MPI, which can be compared across countries, it's 10 indicators of if somebody's malnourished in the household, if a child has died, if a child is out of school, if nobody has completed 6 years of schooling, if they lack clean energy, safe water, adequate sanitation, good housing materials, electricity, and a basic set of assets. And very simply, if a person is deprived in one of those indicators, they get a 1 or a colored box on the screen. And if they're not, it's a 0 or a white box. And you apply the weights here equally nested across 3 dimensions, and you add it up. So each person gets a deprivation score, which reflects the percentage of deprivations they carry simultaneously at the same time. Now, one deprivation is not poverty, and so poverty cutoff identifies who's poor because their deprivation score is at or above the poverty line, in this case, 1/3. And then we can do the measurement. We can say what percentage of people are poor, something a journalist or a mother or grandmother can understand in any part of a country. And what's their average intensity? What percentage of deprivations on average do poor people experience? But we can also, because of the structure of the measure, multiply them together and find the percentage of deprivations that poor people are experiencing, which is the MPI. So that's an overall statistic. For example, in the case of Nigeria, 51.4% of people are poor, and on average, each person carries 56.6% of the deprivations. But then we can pull down to say, well, how are they deprived across those indicators? What percentage of people are poor and are so simultaneously deprived and deprived in each one of those indicators? And that is perhaps a link to policy, but I would love to learn from you how to make it better. That, of course, can be disaggregated. So by states of Nigeria, by children, by ethnicity, disability status, anything the data permit. And then you can see the weighted composition of indicators and how it varies across different subgroups of society. And so it's this information platform that tries to take the information back from a simple headline back to people in the offices who need a little bit more understanding of how situations differ. So how might this be useful? Well, we really go to partners and learn from them what they are doing. So we simply work on the measurement part, but in many countries, these policy entrepreneurs have thought about their own situations and then use a metric like this to do their jobs better. So clearly tracking and monitoring poverty over time so that you have a monetary measure, which is essential and terribly important, and then you have a complementary measure of non-monetary. And they don't always move together. And particularly subnationally, there might be one region which has very low monetary poverty and yet has high multidimensional poverty. For example, Sylhet in Bangladesh, or Gaza in Bhutan, or Papua in Indonesia. So there can be mismatches between the two measures, which are interesting because they tell a fuller story than either one could tell alone. And they also permit poverty to be compared. For example, in the indigenous comarcas of Panama, poverty is over 90%, but in Panama City or the less poor places, it's 4% or 8%. And knowing the level of poverty, but also its composition sectorally, combining that with whatever kind of budget models are used, or user costs or microsimulations, means that you can try to allocate the budget more precisely. So in Costa Rica, recognizing there was a mismatch between the budget and the character of poverty, according to their national MPI, they tried to realign it, both at the subnational level and the sectoral level, with the same fiscal envelope, could create some accelerations in terms of reduction. Perhaps a key, and this is where I would love to have your inputs, because many of you walk in different sectors, is to ask how can this tool be used as a management tool or as a coordination tool. For example, in the case of Colombia, McKinsey and others helped the government to set results and key performance indicators. And because they updated their national MPI annually, they created a roundtable chaired by the president with ministers not able to send deputies, where they could each, in a sense, articulate what they had done for the indicators, but also recognize that sometimes they needed to work together to move the needle on a particular indicator. And they could have alerts of indicators that were not moving and nudge them using a very simple dashboard of red, yellow, and green. So not all of the standard errors and the robustness tests, but something that helped them to work together among communities that often might compete. And then clearly there's with the disaggregation, one can just simply do geographic targeting, but also integrating some of the MPI questions in simplified form into censuses or registry information has been useful, for example, in Chile or in Bhutan, in order to target households for individual programming, complementing conditional cash transfers by, again, bringing into view people who may not be monetary poor, but might be multidimensionally poor. And another example is, in a sense, from the business sector, that businesses might do a survey of their own employees on a voluntary basis, using the national MPI for their country to assess how many of their own employees would be considered poor. And with very important privacy and ethical guarantees, then find a response. In Costa Rica, this was done initially by the largest bank in collaboration with Horizonte Positivo, a private sector group. And they found that 12% of their employees were poor, when 14% were poor nationally. And so they were able then to have different strategies alongside building solidarity, building productivity of the workers, but also really understanding the situations of their employees a little bit better. That work is now going into other countries as well. So these are some of the ways that people around us have innovated and tried to use measurement tools to link to their own actions. And so I think the question now in the time of COVID is, we all are looking out and feeling dread with the impact that this will have on the life chances of people who already have many comorbidities because they do not have hand washing, or because they live in overcrowded places, or lack the ability to protect themselves, and also because they may fall into poverty from job loss or from other things. And so the question is, how can these tools be helpful? And one very simple way is to simply try to quantify, using existing data, some of these comorbidities or vulnerabilities. To give a very simple example, using the data of the global MPI, which cover 5.7 billion people in 101 countries in 2019, we picked out 3 indicators: nutrition, clean water, and clean cooking fuel, which is associated otherwise with acute respiratory infections. And 3.6 billion people have one of the deprivations. 472 million of them have all 3 at the same time. And of them, 83.5% of those 472 million have other deprivations beside. And so just trying to understand and overlay this information with other data sources to get a fuller picture of different kinds of vulnerability. How is this used at the country level? I'll give an example of Colombia, where they used a census-based MPI, which is geo-referenced, within 2 weeks of a difficult time for COVID, to target families who were not beneficiaries of conditional cash transfers because they were deprived in informal work or health conditions, or because they had other vulnerabilities like overcrowding or intergenerational households. So having the MPI in the census database already up and running, but then also able to pull in other indicators that were relevant for COVID. And we've been able to work alongside a number of covered countries that are trying to do this blend between multidimensional poverty and new vulnerabilities to target the existing and new poor in different ways. And they also overlaid the MPI with health record data to look at urban patterns of contagion for over 1,000 municipalities. So these are some of the ways that groups have been using the measures. I expect we can think a lot more, but of course this depends on data. And so some of the strategic challenges in the short term are not just to extend multidimensional analyses using existing data, but to really innovate in data collection with rapid remote surveys that include core poverty indicators, sometimes partnering with non-traditional, we work mainly with national statistics offices, but partnering now with people doing other kinds of surveys, figuring out how to have a good sampling frame with remote surveys and improve the data quality, or at least understand the data quality, and how to link it with other data sources. And also, as the 2020 census is paused, integrating multidimensional metrics into those post-COVID. And then bringing in some of the coordination, which in a time of humanitarian need, with additional actors from civil society, from business, and from the international agencies, requires even more coordination and a more clear common objective. But the most important, and I'll end on this, is really to try to position poverty, and this is where the Boris Mints Institute might be a core partner, to try to position poverty as a key post-emergency goal. Many of you will have read Amartya Sen's article in the FT or previous works in which he recognized with admiration how Britain handled the food shortages during the Second World War with rationing and social support, and observing that they created a measurable change in that life expectancy had increased 1.2 years for men in the decade before the war, but they actually, life expectancy increased 6.5 years during the war, and for women it was 7. And so that was a time of tragedy, but the concern for the bottom of the distribution came to the fore, and it was effective. In July this year, we will release with UNDP the 2020 global MPI data, updating it for 1 billion people, but we'll also release trends over time for 5 billion people. And Pedro Conceição, the head of that office, was in Sierra Leone during the time of the Ebola crisis. And out of the 75-some countries that we cover, Sierra Leone actually had the fastest reduction in multidimensional poverty. And furthermore, it did so during the same 4 years as the Ebola crisis, 2013 to 2017. And Ebola was there from 2013 December to 2016. Poverty during those 4 years fell from 74% to 58% multidimensionally. And in each indicator, although driven by changes in nutrition, school attendance, and health. And we know that pandemics are messy. Governments have to respond at galloping space. There are mistakes that are made, but the hope is that there would be some possibilities, even despite the tragic circumstances, by a clear goal, well communicated, well measured, but measurement is not the answer, it's the incentive and maybe the recognition. There could become a historic inflection point in reducing poverty in monetary forms and in multidimensional forms. And so we would love very much to try to work together with others because no one actor can advance this work. We must work together. But that might be a way that a multidimensional metric could be part of the Boris Mints Institute's strategic policy solution for global challenges. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sabina Alkire, for your fascinating insights into poverty and for your dedication to supporting the world's poorest communities, especially now during the COVID-19 era. You really are an inspiration. And for the final part of today's ceremony, allow me to hand over to Professor Armen Darbinyan, Rector of the Russian Armenian University in Yerevan, the former Prime Minister of Armenia, the chairman of the Boris Mints Institute Advisory Board, who will facilitate questions to Professor Alkire from members of the Institute's Advisory Board and from former laureate Professor Michael Kremer. Professor Darbinian.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. First of all, I want to congratulate Professor Alkire for this great prize and to wish to follow the example and tradition which is already established by Professor Michael Kremer, and to get the Nobel Prize next. This is our common wish to you. Thank you for your presentation. My first question would be, do you think that there is a moment, taking the present circumstances into consideration, do you think that there is a moment where you can include in your multi-dimensional poverty index some kind of an emotional parameter which shows the readiness of the society to work together, to combine efforts, to unify efforts in the present pandemic, because the pandemic showed that the societies which we previously considered as rich showed the emotional poverty. So what's your reaction to that?
No, that's a fascinating question and not an easy one, but there are two answers. The bracket answer, not the real one, but just an obvious one, is that we have to use demographic and health survey data for around 52 countries, multiple indicator cluster survey data for 40-some countries, and national surveys. And we tend to have to use all of the data from the same survey. And so the perceptual data or the emotional data are not in those surveys at present. So to add them in, we would have to do something different at a disaggregated level, but probably not at the household level. But I think more importantly, I think it is important and possible to measure those kinds of assessments. I remember some interesting measures that I think Mandura did of collective efficacy, where you ask people, it's self-report, but it's deliberated self-report. You say, how sure are you that you could lift a 5-pound bag of flour? How about a 10-pound? How about a 50-pound or 100-pound? So you get people used to the idea of assessing their own efficacy. And then you ask them about a collective problem, action problem. How sure are you that in your community you could stop this kind of a tragedy from happening, or you could report it or intervene? And this one and this one. And that assessment, self-assessment of efficacy would be, I think, the kind of indicator that you were looking for. I haven't seen those built into poverty surveys. We do in Bhutan a group gross national happiness survey, and that does have, for example, questions on animosity and on belonging and some other community variables like volunteering and donations, but it doesn't have this particular assessment of the ability to work together. And that would be very important, but alas, at the moment we cannot.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think it's a great challenge now to try to include some emotional parameters into your calculations. Thank you. The floor is given now to Dr. Boris Mints for the next question. Please, Boris.
No, thank you. I hope we will have meeting with Professor Alkire face to face. I ask you, but now I will not use the time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Then I will turn to Professor Michael Kremer and invite him for a discussion. Professor, the Nobel Prize laureate Michael Kremer, who is very known in the world by his research on developing societies. And I think now, taking again this pandemic into consideration, we can consider the global world society as developing one. Professor Kremer, the floor is yours, please.
Great, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here for the BMI event, and wonderful to be celebrating this and seeing the recognition of this wonderful and very important work. I'm one of the many reasons I'm excited about this is that many people outside of economics often think that economists see the goal as maximizing GNP. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, even the most orthodox economists don't see the goal as maximizing GNP. There's a saying that economics has a concept of final goods and intermediate goods. So a final good would be something like bread that you eat. An intermediate good might be a machine that's used in making the bread, or tractor. There was a saying that for Stalin, steel was a final good and bread was an intermediate good, an input into making steel. And it's very important that we don't make that mistake and that we recognize what the final good is. And I think the work that's being recognized today on multidimensional measures of poverty is an important reinforcement of that lesson, an important step forward in that lesson. I have really two questions. The first is there are some people who want to focus on a single dimension and who don't want to pay attention or find it difficult to pay attention to the multidimensional nature of poverty that you mentioned. And I wonder whether for them, as a very imperfect measure, it might be better to focus on log income rather than income. And perhaps if we focused on log income, it would at least be somewhat more correlated with what we actually care about. And then the other question was precisely about COVID-19. Was wondering about your thoughts for rapid measurement in an age of COVID-19. I feel that a lot of policy has been very hampered by the absence of good information, both on the spread of the disease, on the epidemiological parameters, and on the impacts on a host of other variables from other dimensions of health, which there's indications are falling, healthcare utilization's falling, to education, to livelihoods. So wondered what your thoughts were on rapid measurement in an age of COVID-19 in a way that can inform policy.
Please, Professor. Thank you. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. So for the second first, yes, we primarily use household survey data and census data. But as you know, all household surveys are paused where there's a COVID lockdown, and censuses will also perhaps be delayed. And so there's a danger of a data desert where we cannot even see the shape of poverty as it changes. And we know with trepidation that it may rise, but we really need that data. And so there's a challenge. And there are many innovations, as you know, going on. The possibility of phone surveys, if ethical safeguards are allowed, many national statistics would have the telephone numbers of respondents from a recent survey. And if the ethics permits, they would then be able to recontact respondents to, at least in the short term, get a representative sample, but using a remote software. But the problem doesn't stop there, because the phones can run out of battery, they can be changed, the wrong person can answer the phone, or the interviews can be interrupted. And so there are many, many challenges to the remote and rapid surveys. And yet, in this time, the hope is that, and many of the international agencies are working on that, World Bank, UNDP, UNICEF, it could actually create a leapfrog. It could create a bit of a breakthrough in how we can do other than face-to-face survey data collection. And so it's the only thing that we can do, perhaps, for multidimensional measures where we need several at the same time. And so we have, in a number of countries, used initially the SWIFT surveys of the World Bank, and now rapid socioeconomic impact assessments to build vulnerability indices in COVID, and all have been collected remotely. And so it's not perfect, but at least it's a new data source, and that's hopefully one that will be improved in the times to come. In terms of income or log income, I would rather have a conversation with the persons just to explore more of their assumptions about the non-monetary behaviors of individual indicators or of multidimensional indicators. In the data on changes over time, we are able to match $1.90 a day and MPI data for a set of countries and look at their trends with common start and end dates. And they're quite different. And so the assumption that the trends would move together, which was already broken by François Bourguignon, Stefan Claassen, Stefan Durkin, and others in papers during the MDG era, that monetary poverty reductions don't track reductions in non-monetary goals. That's again corroborated by the evidence. And so I would suggest, rather than making an assumption that a log income would approximate other deprivations, it might be interesting to have a conversation about looking at them more directly and just look at the data. There's nothing ideological, all are important, but they actually behave quite differently. And so just learning that, and we continue to learn ourselves.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers. The next question will be given to Ms. Joel Alfalo, a member of the Boris Mints Institute Board and president of the Maternelle Foundation. Please, Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, because I see you, I saw in Erevan what you have done for the adapting yourself not to have people and putting the names through. And it was very interesting as a non-modern and modern country. Congratulations.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Pragmatically, what I see is we are going in a new era. And if we compare the COVID with the HIV, we will have to learn to live with that. Yes, it creates new poverty or bigger poverty. We saw the two things, as said, the Armenian people coming and helping, humanity, and some others saying, oh, I have my house, my garden, I'm protected. What's going outside, it's not my business, or I'm lucky to escape of it. I understand that humanity has to either address it, like Damian said, emotional. It's not emotional, it's pragmatic. Either we will have to deal with that worldwide, and it has been shown that it's worldwide, because the impact will come and hit the rich countries or supposed rich country. So when you do your parameter now, do you consider things which are unusual, because that new era will bring new thinking, new parameter, new analysis for poverty and what we call poverty?
Yes, Professor Alkire.
Thank you so much. I think that it's really changing the definitions of poverty and perhaps of well-being, because at least in the UK, for example, loneliness and social connection come up very strongly. And these are experienced in the brain the same way as physical pain. They lead to an immobilization of the productivity of the person in the same way. And so really understanding the importance of relationships and of good relationships, safe relationships, and how impoverishing it can be not to have those. So I think in some countries, the definitions of poverty will elaborate and work. Yes, it has a productive and an economic benefit, but it also has a benefit in terms of the internal state of some people. And so it's the economic equivalent of the income is not the same as the meaningfulness, perhaps, of having a good job, a meaningful job. And so I think that there will be very much a change in how data permit there to be elaboration. Some of these more emotional and relational and exercise-related, nature-related aspects of human well-being and human impoverishment are considered, and perhaps the importance of some of these hitherto unrecognized aspects of poverty will be pulled out more strongly. In doing so, it might also be that some benefits in poorer communities are also recognized. I mentioned earlier the case of Bhutan. They have a gross national happiness index, and they have a multidimensional poverty index. And what's interesting is that they're not the same. So some of the areas that are quite poor in a material sense are very rich in a cultural and relational sense. In community, culture, psychological well-being, they're strong. But in the material dimensions, they are poor. And so seeing this very tapestry of different dimensions of our lives is important individually, but also as societies as we see it changes. And so we can be worried if some of the more emotional factors increase, then we need to measure it and see it and have a deliberated decision of how to prioritize those.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Alkire. The next floor is given to former Prime Minister of Montenegro, our good friend, Igor Lukšić. Please, Igor.
Thank you, Armen. I'd like to congratulate Professor Alkire for this prize and this very interesting keynote speech. I think it comes in extremely interesting times, given the impact of the COVID-19 to the economies worldwide. The lockdowns, or the Great Lockdown, as the crisis has been already named, produces different results. To some people, it presents an opportunity because they seem to be quick to innovate and come around with some solutions that could enable them further. But for many other people, it comes as a great challenging times in which they suffer. And as you know, and you have reflected on that as well, in many economies, there are a lot of informal parts of the economies. And all those people are incredibly susceptible to sudden shocks. And obviously, the poverty rate will grow in many countries. And that's very unfortunate. Hopefully, it will be only for the time for some relatively short period of time. But again, a lot of people argued that coming back to normal life will take much longer than we anticipate. And the new normal we need to adapt to will produce a lot of adaptations, which won't be easy. Plus, the disruptions of a lot of supply chains affect as well people's lives and could also bring about more poverty. So this is really fascinating work that you've been dealing with. I myself currently also work on one study that relates to Montenegro, and it has to do with social impact or more economic impact or economic impact assessment of the COVID-19. And it is based on the large research through which many companies, small, medium, micro companies are asked for their views. But also it will touch upon the employment aspect and some elements of the informal economy, and it combined could give us kind of the description of the situation, but also help us draw some recommendations how to improve policies. And this is really important. I think every research, if it brings about some recommendations for policy improvement, that's really incredibly important and useful. I wonder how you see also the interaction between, for example, well, GDP is usually the figure normally countries use to measure their progress and compare to each other and so on. Even corrected by PPP terms, it can be misleading quite often if it doesn't really include some of the aspects you've been talking about. But how do you see also the relation with the Human Development Index that UNDP has been developing for already a couple of decades, which corrects GDP and the quality of living with education, with health, and other aspects that may actually give us a better view on what goes on in a system that we'd like to analyze. Thank you.
Please, Professor Alkire.
Thank you so much. No, that's such a lot of questions. Because we work primarily one by one with different governments, then the policy recommendations would be different in every place, and it would depend really on the quantitative analysis that we have and also on the policies that they are or are not implementing. So it's difficult to give general ones, but the areas of engagement that I sketched in terms of budget, of targeting, where to target more or less, where to budget more or less, where the coordination and lack of coordination is a problem. But some other things that I didn't have time to measure mention is some of the more strategic factors, such as, for example, I mentioned Colombia, but in Colombia, there are also groups that were victims of the violence or that were combatants that had to be reintegrated. And so policies, to identify these groups and then to integrate them and sometimes give them priority because there was a political mandate or a window of the peace accord that had to be met. These other larger policy frameworks interact with poverty measurement and reset the priorities, and that's incredibly important to do and to have that interaction between different goals and not just one at a time. In terms of the level of income of the country, that's very important. I mentioned the global MPI, which in Armenia or Montenegro is very, very low, so it's not an appropriate measure, but it goes up to 92% in a country like Niger or South Sudan. But what was interesting in the report this year is that we looked at the subnational regions, over 1,000 of them. We found in high-income countries, the levels even in subnational regions are quite low. But in upper middle income countries, poverty ranges from 0 to over 70% of people being poor in some subnational region of some upper middle income country. In low middle income countries, it's from 0 to 86%. And in low income countries, it's from 1% to 99%. So you have some regions of low income countries doing fantastic and some of low or lower middle income or upper middle income that are lower. And so I think just trying to grasp the nuance while recognizing that broadly an increase in income does lead very happily to, or is associated with a much lower level generally of multidimensional poverty. When we have a comparable measure like that, we can go ahead. So those are just a few of the thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our two board members, Alex Pesov and Seppo Reimers, I invite you also for a discussion, please. Seppo, please turn on the microphone. Seppo, we can hear you. We can't hear you. Okay. Okay. Alex, Dr. Pesov, it's my pleasure of inviting you to discussion.
Thank you very much, Armin. Unfortunately, or fortunately, Professor Alkire already answered my question. It was a part of a question from Joel. We always are in tandem, in sort of tandem with Joel. So I just I was thinking about cultural codes of different nations. I think, and you already did it. So my congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Other questions, please? If no question, so I have to congratulate once again Professor Alkire for the Boris Mints Institute Prize and wish you all the success in your future researches and activities. And I hope, and we all hope, that in someday we can have a gathering together and be not only online, but also in line with each other. Thank you very much. Thank you. And congratulations, congratulations to all of you, all of us, actually, for this great event. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Darbinian. Sorry, Professor Alkire, did you want to say something?
No, I want to say thank you very, very much to each of you. I wish that we could be together, and I wish I could express my gratitude better, but I'm very, very grateful, and I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. But thank you very much.
Thank you, and we congratulate you again, and thank you to all the speakers during this historic first digital award ceremony of the Boris Mints Prize, and for sharing your insights into the crucial issue of understanding and reducing poverty. Thank you to Dr. Mintz and everyone at the Boris Mints Institute and to Tel Aviv University for supporting such vital research. We look forward, as you do, Professor Alkire, to further developments and discussion from the Institute that will benefit communities worldwide. We wish you all good health as the ceremony comes to an end. Thank you again for joining us. Goodbye, or as we say in Hebrew, Shalom v'lehitraot.
Thank you. Well done. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.